like the breeze, country roads sing.
For millions of people, the voice of John Denver was pure joy. It was the sound of sunshine on your shoulders, a rocky mountain high, and country roads taking you home. He was America's wholesome, smiling troubadour, a man whose entire personality seemed crafted from the natural world he sang about. So when his small plane fell from the sky into Monterey Bay in the fall of 1997, it was seen as a tragic, freak accident. A sudden, cruel twist of fate that extinguished a brilliant light. That's the story most of us have believed for decades, but the official report on his death, a nearly 50-page, methodical analysis from the National Transportation Safety Board, doesn't tell the story of a freak accident. It details a preventable tragedy, a disaster that was years in the making. The story of John Denver's final flight isn't just about a faulty plane. It's about a troubled man, a series of unbelievably poor decisions, and a fatal design flaw that all came together in the worst way imaginable. For years, fans have held on to a simple story, but the truth, buried in official documents, has been there all along, and it is not pretty. To really understand how John Denver ended up in a fatal nosedive over the Pacific, you have to understand the incredible heights he fell from, both literally and figuratively. Born Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., the son of a decorated Air Force pilot, he always seemed destined for the skies. But it was music that truly gave him flight. In the late 60s and early 70s, he just exploded onto the scene with a sound that was like a bomb for a nation exhausted by war and division. His songs seemed so simple, but they hit deep. Leaving on a Jet Plane, Take Me Home, Country Roads, Annie's Song, and Rocky Mountain High weren't just hits, they became part of the culture. They painted a picture of an America full of natural beauty, simple love, and peace. Denver himself became the face of that image. With his signature glasses, shaggy hair, and that constant smile, he radiated a gentle sincerity. He was a passionate environmentalist and humanitarian who seemed to live the values he sang about, racking up 33 gold and platinum records and becoming one of the most beloved entertainers of his time. But behind all that sunshine, shadows were gathering. The crushing pressure of fame started to take its toll. In his own autobiography, Denver admitted to struggling with depression and insecurity. His first marriage to Annie Martel, the woman who inspired his most famous love song, began to fall apart. The public saw a perfect couple, but behind closed doors, things were volatile. The tension finally erupted in an infamous incident where Denver, in a fit of rage, took a chainsaw to their marital bed and kitchen table. It was a shocking, violent act that was the complete opposite of his peaceful public image. The divorce in 1982 was brutal and left him scarred, and that private turmoil? It started to spill out in a very public, and very dangerous, way. In August of 1993, John Denver was pulled over in his Porsche in Aspen. He was weaving, and his blood alcohol level was 0.14, well over the limit. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to perform a benefit concert, but he didn't stay out of trouble. Just a year later, in August 1994, he was arrested for a second DUI after crashing that same Porsche into a tree. The consequences this time were far more serious. For a man who loved flying as much as music, the punishment was a nightmare. The FAA took notice and sent him a stern warning in 1995. If he wanted to keep flying, he had to stop drinking completely. He seemed to comply for a while, but he also admitted in interviews that he hadn't achieved total sobriety. That public admission was his undoing. In 1996, the FAA learned he'd failed to stay sober and officially revoked his medical certificate. Without that certificate, a pilot's license is worthless. John Denver, an experienced pilot with over 2,700 flight hours, was legally grounded. This wasn't just a legal penalty, it was the low point of a decade-long decline. His second marriage had also ended badly in 1993. He felt alienated from the music industry and was even excluded from the "We Are the World" charity single, a cause he cared about deeply. His struggles with alcohol were no secret, and now they had cost him one of the greatest joys in his life. He was a man adrift, legally forbidden from his passion, haunted by failed relationships and the ghost of the superstar he used to be. This was the man who, in the fall of 1997, started looking for a new airplane. The second part of this tragedy isn't about the man, but the machine. And it wasn't just any machine. The aircraft John Denver bought just weeks before his death was a Rudin Long-Easy. To call it an airplane is almost an understatement. It looked like something from the future. Designed by the legendary Burt Rutan, the Long-Easy was a home-built or experimental aircraft. It was sleek, fast, and efficient, with a canard wing at the front and the main wing and propeller at the back. For a pilot like Denver, the appeal was obvious. But that word, experimental, is crucial. These planes are often built from kits by amateurs in their garages, which means builders can make their own modifications. The person who built Denver's specific Long-Easy had made one such change, a modification that he thought would improve safety but would instead prove to be catastrophically fatal. The problem was the fuel system. A Long-Easy has two fuel tanks, one in each wing, and the pilot has to be able to switch between them. Burt Rutan's original design put the fuel selector valve right between the pilot's legs, an intuitive, easy-to-reach spot. The builder of Denver's plane, however, worried about fuel lines running through the cockpit. So, he moved the entire fuel valve to the other side of the firewall, behind the pilot. This meant the handle to switch fuel tanks was now located on the bulkhead, behind the pilot's left shoulder. Think about that for a second. To perform a routine, critical function, switching fuel tanks, the pilot would have to take their hand off the control stick, unbuckle their harness, twist their body nearly all the way around, and blindly grope for a handle they couldn't even see. It was an ergonomic nightmare, a design flaw so profound it had nearly caused a disaster before, and the problems didn't stop there. The fuel gauges were also located behind the pilot's seat, making them impossible to read during flight without using a small mirror. On top of that, the gauges were known to be unreliable. This was a time bomb disguised as an airplane. It was a brilliant Burt Rutan design, sabotaged by a builder's modification that ignored a basic rule of aviation: human factors. The system demanded a level of contortion and blind luck that was just not safe. John Denver knew about this flaw. On the day of the crash, he and a mechanic discussed the impossible-to-reach handle. They even tried clamping vice grip pliers onto it to make it longer, but it didn't work. Denver couldn't reach it. Tragically, he came up with a workaround in his head. He told the mechanic that if he ran low on fuel, he'd just engage the autopilot to keep the plane level while he twisted around to reach the handle. It was a fatal assumption. This flawed machine was now waiting on the tarmac, and the second path to tragedy was set. On October 12, 1997, these two paths, the troubled man and the flawed machine, finally began to merge. It was a beautiful, clear, calm day on the California coast. Perfect flying weather. Denver had only owned the Long-Easy for 2 weeks and had just 1/2-hour flight in it the day before. He was still unfamiliar with the plane and its deadly fuel system. That afternoon, as he prepped for a short flight to practice takeoffs and landings, the mechanic offered to refuel the plane. Denver declined. He said he'd only be flying for about an hour and figured he had enough fuel. This was his first critical mistake of the day. The NTSB investigation later found the plane was already low on fuel before he even took off. He climbed into the cockpit, a place he was not legally allowed to be. He was flying without a license. He was piloting a high-performance experimental aircraft he barely knew. And he knew it had a critical design flaw that made a basic flight operation incredibly dangerous. Every decision he made that afternoon added another link to the chain. His last communication was a routine call to the tower at 5:27 p.m. His voice was calm, with no sign of distress. There was no mayday. No panic. Just silence. Shortly after that call, witnesses on the ground heard the plane's engine sputter. A series of pops and coughs, the classic sound of fuel starvation. At an altitude of only 500 feet, the sleek aircraft had suddenly become a glider. This was the moment. The moment every bad decision converged. The left fuel tank had run dry. The engine was dead. Panic must have set in. He needed to switch to the right tank, and he had to do it right now. The NTSB's reconstruction of the accident paints a harrowing picture. They believe Denver tried his dangerous workaround. He likely engaged the autopilot. He would have then unstrapped his harness, contorted his body, and turned to blindly grope for that valve. As he did this, investigators believe his right foot jammed down on the right rudder pedal. Pushing a rudder hard will cause any plane to swing sideways. In a long easy, with no engine power at low speed, the effect would have been violent. The plane would have banked sharply right and pitched its nose down. Thrown off balance while twisted in his seat, Denver would have been completely disoriented and unable to regain control. From the ground, people saw the plane's engine sputter, then watched as it banked hard to the right and plunged into a steep nosedive. It hit the water with incredible force, disintegrating on impact. The collision of the man and the machine was complete. John Denver was killed instantly. In the aftermath, as news of the crash shocked the world, the NTSB began its investigation. Without a black box, they had to piece the story together from witnesses, the wreckage, and Denver's own history. Speculation was everywhere. Was it suicide? Was it alcohol? The NTSB looked into everything. The autopsy provided a clear answer: there was absolutely no alcohol or drugs in his system. His personal demons may have led him to be in that cockpit illegally, but they hadn't clouded his mind on his final flight. The suicide theory was also dismissed. All the evidence pointed not to intent, but to a desperate, failed attempt to solve a sudden crisis. The NTSB's final report laid out the chain of events with chilling clarity. The probable cause of the accident was the pilot's diversion of attention and inadvertent application of right rudder while trying to switch fuel tanks, but they went further, identifying the factors that made this pilot error almost inevitable. First, was his failure to refuel the airplane. Taking off with low fuel set the whole disaster in motion. Second, was the builder's catastrophic decision to move the fuel selector valve, creating an unsafe condition. Third, was Denver's own lack of familiarity with the aircraft. He simply didn't have the experience in that specific plane to handle an emergency. The mystery of his death wasn't a mystery at all. It was a fatal cascade that began years earlier with personal struggles that cost him his pilot's license. It was amplified by his decision to fly illegally, compounded by his failure to refuel, and sealed by a design flaw that turned a routine task into a death trap. It wasn't a freak accident. It was a tragedy born from a perfect storm of human error and mechanical failure. The full story of John Denver's final flight is a stark reminder of how hidden struggles and a few bad decisions can lead to disaster. These kinds of detailed investigations are so important for understanding what really happened and preventing it from happening again. If you find this kind of deep dive compelling, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We'd also like to know in the comments, were you aware of the full story behind Denver's death, or did you, like so many, believe it was just a tragic accident? In the end, John Denver wasn't killed by a single mistake, but by the weight of many. The story isn't pretty because it forces us to look past the smiling, wholesome caricature and see a complicated, flawed, and deeply human person. It's the story of a man who loved flying so much that he was willing to break the law to do it, a man whose personal battles had cost him dearly, and a man who, on one clear afternoon, found himself in the wrong plane at the wrong time. The tragedy isn't just that he died in a plane crash. The real tragedy is that it was so preventable. If he had dealt with the issues that lost him his license, if he had simply refueled the plane, if the builder hadn't made that one critical change, John Denver would have likely landed safely. His legacy lives on in timeless songs of grace and homecoming. But the story of his end is a darker, more complex ballad. It's a cautionary tale about how our own demons and our decisions can set us on a collision course with a reality that doesn't forgive. The sunshine on his shoulders had faded, and on that clear October day, the country roads did not take him home.